Hey, everybody. Welcome to Distorted Podcast. We're going to be doing some mental health conversation, and I'm Lenny, and today I'm joined by Kailey Shelburn. She's an LAC. She graduated from Liberty University, has some background in trauma and EMDR, and we're going to talk about that today. Mother of two young little boys. They're precious, and she's out of Austin, Texas right now. So welcome to the show, Kailey. What I'd like to do is maybe have you start us off by let's introduce EMDR to the audience, just a little bit of a background on what that is, and then why we use it for things like trauma for clients.
Yeah, so EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it's a therapy technique used to pull traumatic memories and things that are taken in to the brain, to the body as a traumatic instance, and reprocessing through the things that have been difficult that cause current triggers. And we use this in therapy because a lot of clients come in with triggers, and EMDR is more of a fast-paced approach where you can target something pretty specific and see a result pretty fast.
It's a way to get them unstuck.
Yeah.
Okay. And it uses, tell me if I'm right on this, you can use multiple ways to do it. You can use it with light, sound, motion, and it's a way to sort of allow the brain to go to a deeper level so that they can process the parts of the memories that are harmful to them. And then they're able to do that in a safer environment with sort of through the lens of what's present. And it helps them sort of separate from the actual trauma. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Okay. The way that I like to describe it is that you're like 1 foot in the past, but also 1 foot in the present. So sometimes people get confused because they think it's some type of memory resurgence and things are going to come up that you've forgotten. And that might happen, but that's not the intention of EMDR. And so, yes, you do use something that's, without getting too technical, it's called a bilateral stimulation. And it basically helps speed up the process of processing through something that's difficult. And so When I practice it, I use buzzers, which it feels like a cell phone vibrating in both of your hands. And that creates that bilateral stimulation where it gets both sides of your brain working.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So to that end, I'm sure there's other ways, obviously there's other ways we can approach trauma, but let's kind of unpack this for people. So I know from my experience, a lot of times that I get people that come in with a traumatic event or a history, I tend to have to start from a really slow-paced therapy intervention, right? At least as far as you're talking about with EMDR, it sort of accelerates that process, which to me makes a lot of sense because when you're doing talk therapy, a lot of the times I have to sort of find out how much historical trauma there is, right? There might be a singular event, but then there might be multiple events. And I usually have to take time to sort of work through the idea of how much trauma have they experienced. What's your take on that? Just the idea of the difference between a client that might come in with a singular traumatic event versus multiple.
Mm-hmm. I think with a singular event, you can kind of jump into EMDR as long as the client is ready for EMDR right away. Where sometimes in talk therapy, it can take a little bit longer.
Is there a screening process for that? You kind of mentioned, is there a process that you use to sort of to determine if it's going to be, can I jump right in versus do I need to do more of the talk therapy before we do it?
Yes. Yeah. The client definitely needs to be able to feel confident in regulating themselves and coping on their own because EMDR can and usually does bring up a lot of emotion because the reality of the instance or the memory comes to the surface. And so when the client goes home, if you're still in the middle of processing something and you didn't get all the way through that target memory that day, you want the client to be able to be okay when they go home.
Right. It can open them up to the vulnerability of experiencing something and not realizing how it's still hitting them.
Yeah. It turns the brain on and makes their brain really start running and processing through it. And so they do have to be ready. So talk therapy definitely is integrated into it because they have to have that readiness to be able to successfully complete EMDR.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. So I think that that's something that I run into where when I'm trying to take somebody through the process, and I usually use a cognitive approach to most of the things that I do, but having someone take the time to recognize the reality of who they are now, the skills that they have now, the way that they can approach the memory from their current experience, their current knowledge, versus trying to relive it from when it actually happened. I find that to be one of the biggest differences, is that the experience happened to them at a time when they couldn't, especially if it's from childhood, right? Where they didn't have the same skills and ability to sort of think their way through it or process through it, versus them as a young adult or an older adult. They're able to, at least in the present, have more words that they can use. They have a stronger understanding of the scope of emotion, right? The guilt or the shame that might come with it, or the anger. Let's touch on that a little bit, like just the different types of emotions that you see connected strongly with people who are revisiting trauma or who have experienced trauma. Is there any particular emotions that stand out to you that you see a lot of?
A lot of clients, the most common one that I've seen is feeling unsafe, or feeling out of control. That seems to be one that comes up. Those emotions come up a lot, which in some sense leads back into the thought process of that's where the distortion comes in.
Yeah, absolutely.
That they're not actually unsafe in the present moment. They were, and they took it in then, but now currently they're feeling like that. So like the past becomes present. And so, that like feeling is really strong for clients.
Yeah, I've experienced that too with somebody has something happen real time, not nearly as severe, and it feels like the same. It feels just as severe. Like I'll see that a lot with abandonment that comes from like a breakup of a relationship or a disconnect with a family member, that the trauma was based in that because of either, disconnection from parents, that there was abuse with parenting, or there was some type of disconnect, a divorce that happened at a very early age that never got to be thought about as to what was the effect of the divorce when it happened. And I see that then when they are currently in their own relationships, they get some of those feelings coming up, maybe not recognizing the connection, and it hits them as just as severe as if it was, reliving that old trauma, even though I think maybe intellectually they know they're not. Emotionally, they're experiencing it as if it, it's the same almost, right? Does that sound about right?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the common phrases that I've heard clients say is like, I don't know why I'm feeling like this, or like, I don't know why this is affecting me this much.
Yeah.
And that's like one of those like key moments as a therapist where you're like, okay, there's something else that's there, because you're responding in a way that isn't necessarily like the normal way that maybe you could be responding. Yeah.
And we won't go down this rabbit trail, but ADD is a terrible thing to waste. Sometimes I see this with somebody that comes in with a personality disorder, that their emotional reaction is exponentially bigger than it would be. And so with trauma, we see that same thing. And I think there is some correlation between the amount of time it takes to really help somebody through trauma, similar to the way you would help somebody through their suffering with one of the 10 personality disorders, that there's more time needed, because they're not just regulating the emotion, they're figuring out a new way to present, right? So it's incremental. It doesn't move in steps. Like they don't make huge steps. And I think a lot of times they get frustrated because they're still experiencing it at such a high level, and they want to move past it, and they're moving, but it's incremental. And sometimes we have to point that out. Like you're moving in a direction, you're learning how to, like you said, regulate the emotions that you are feeling, separating them from the past experience, but it doesn't necessarily move as fast as they want. So I think it's interesting to make that connection back to EMDR, that technique perhaps does help increase that processing time, which is really great, right? So there's a connection between the normal processing that takes place because of how deep the pain goes, and using a technique like EMDR to sort of help accelerate that process. I don't know if you add to that or make it more colorful or whatever, but I think that's a definite connection for people to hear, right? That there's a slow process trying to go through trauma. It can take a while. EMDR and some of the other things that we might use in therapy is a way to help. I don't want to say smooth the process out because that doesn't sound right, but maybe you can have words for that. Like, what's the connection there? Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes clients come in and they expect EMDR to be like, they expect to start like immediately.
Right.
And so there still is some of that where there's like, it's not like a magical fix necessarily, because there does have to be the readiness with EMDR. I will say though that as far as the pace of it, once you do get into some of the memories, the way that I like to think about it is like, say, for example, you have a memory where the negative belief that's associated with it is, I'm not safe. The way that I see it is like you're pulling out the filing cabinet and there's all of these memories potentially where you feel like you're unsafe. And there's like the heavy hitting one that you use as the example. And so when your brain is processing, sometimes EMDR isn't just targeting one specific memory, but it's really, you're kind of processing through a lot of these other memories too. And so that can take a long time.
Yeah.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
I definitely think it's faster than talking through everything, because with EMDR, you're not required to tell all of the details and go through all of it. Your brain is quickly going through it. But it definitely still takes time. Yeah. Because there's a lot that's there.
And I think when I use a cognitive approach, I try to shortcut by challenging the distortions that are coming alongside the trauma. So it's like you're saying, I don't necessarily want them to have to tell every narrative, even though there's a part of them that might want to. The idea is to because obviously they want the pain to go away. That makes sense. I mean, nobody wants to carry that, and it oftentimes they can feel like there's physical symptoms that go along with it. But I'll use cognitive stuff to sort of, okay, let's hit the distortion that might be extending the lifeline of this trauma. Let's challenge the distortion of the severity, like not that it didn't happen, but the severity that you think it happened at. Maybe there's a way for us to reframe that. And so in a similar way, the idea of trying to again, help the client process, it takes a long time, but giving them ways to sort of develop distance, maybe is the word, from the time of the incident. Because I think there's a natural part of the distancing that causes some healing. So the time and distance and the production of how you process it, the longer you're away from the immediacy of the trauma, I think that's kind of essentially what we do, so that they're getting better as they move farther away from the incident itself. And then I think it matters too if we're talking about external trauma versus internal trauma, right? If we're talking about trauma that happens to the individual versus trauma that you witnessed, like macro level trauma, and I don't want to sound silly here, but like a 9/11 or something where it's an external trauma, just what happened a couple of weeks ago, the loss of somebody. Even if you didn't follow him or agree with Charlie, it impacted people just from the nature of how it happened. And anyone who was there is going to be affected by a certain level of trauma. So there's the external trauma where it's not necessarily related directly to you, and internal trauma. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit. What do you see when you've dealt with clients, the external traumas versus the internal? Is there any difference that you see?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that witnessing an event in itself can be traumatic. And an external trauma, even using the example of Charlie Kirk, of like, you might not have been there on the front row and seen the whole thing. Right. But that doesn't negate the fact that could bring up something that has been an internal thing for you. And I think that the internal trauma obviously is typically what you would be using for EMDR. Okay. And something that you said earlier was making me think about like the like neural pathways, like how your brain immediately jumps to like this one thing happened and like it's so connected with another thing. So like to use an example, if there's a certain situation where you feel out of control, whether or not you're noticing it in that moment, your brain is automatically like going to this place of like, I feel out of control. I am out of control. And so when you're reprocessing, you're getting to this goal of like the positive, more helpful belief,
Right.
Where you're not going there anymore, but you're going somewhere else that's better and that's more healthy for you. I know that that's not necessarily related to the internal external piece of it.
So you see it as the same, though. Inevitably, you're going to deal with how it's affecting them individually, as opposed to the external being you saw something happen. It could even be a car accident on the freeway that you weren't even involved in. So there's a different processing maybe when it comes to something that's not related to you. But what I hear you saying, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that from as far as the viewpoint of the individual, they're still experiencing it as a connection to something that they went through.
Yeah.
So even if the new event is nothing to do with them, there's still a brain connection to an event that was them. Is that kind of what you were saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. I think, if something would have felt, violating in one situation, but you weren't necessarily there, it doesn't mean that it still doesn't feel violating with you not being there.
And I think that's important too to the listeners. It's like that's why this stuff we take it seriously, because it for someone on the outside looking in might say, well, why are you being affected by this? You didn't know this person, or you weren't there, and you can be three times removed from it. It happened in a different state. It happened to people you don't know, and it happened to and yet if you've had previous trauma, there is the potential for it to trigger that. Just because, again, you're not living through the new one, you're living through the old one, right? So I think that people miss that sometimes from an outside perspective. You see that a lot with, I think we both can speak to this too. We've had clients that have come from abusive situations where they're experiencing the abuse, whether it's a new one or whether it's just a reflection of it, because they're either so used to it, or the person who did that to them is still in their experience, still in their life. And so it doesn't have to be a new event.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, to that end, this might also speak to why it takes longer, typically, for someone to work through the layers of trauma. We know that it changes the way the brain processes information to a certain extent, right? That there's a relearning of how to regulate emotion when it's normal. What kind of things have you used before to sort of help people recognize like being cautious versus, okay, so you say a lot of times that they're unsafe, and the idea that you would still have a mechanism, especially as a woman, to have a mechanism for safety, to have a mechanism of being cautious or curious, not paranoid, but to still be aware so you can be as safe as you want to be. Maybe sort of play that one out. I think there's an interesting aspect of this for women, particularly because reality is that there's a lot of unsafe scenarios. And so how do they still trust the instinct to feel unsafe? Like the spidey sense, I used to call it, if you remember back in the day.
Yeah.
That they still have the spidey sense, and you don't want to dismiss it. So maybe speak to that a little bit. Like, how do we untraumatize that actually a positive emotion to have and not have it run crazy with you?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny because I think about, I'm pretty sure you've said this because I don't think I came up with this on my own, but like a little bit of anxiety is a good thing. Like you wouldn't want to just be like,
I have said that, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I figured that came from you. Yeah, I feel like I use that a lot, and I think about that a lot because sometimes I'm like, why am I anxious? But then it's like, it would be abnormal for me to not be anxious in this situation. Right. And so when it comes to safety, there is the element of the safety that might be associated with a traumatic scenario. But then there's also the safety that's associated with the fact that you might just be in an unsafe environment, or there might be like a necessity for a woman to be carrying some type of self-defense.
Sparky instrument. Well, and I would say this, like, if you trust the instinct, right? God gave an instinct to women to be able to, like, my wife always tells me, like, when she was a little kid, she had discernment, you know, and my mother-in-law has spoken about that my wife had discernment, even though she was little. She didn't necessarily want everybody near her, right? That there's an instinct that you don't want to lose the instinct. A long time ago, there was a book, Gift of Fear. I forgot the author off the top of my head, but that spoke about the idea that having an awareness, having a presentation that makes you cautious that's not where the bad thing is. That's not a negative. It's a negative when it has a life of its own and you're not critically thinking about the circumstance. And sometimes, like you said, when it's associated with something that's not actually happening. So I guess that's a tough one to unpack. You know, you have somebody in front of you who's legitimately had a past experience or more than one.
Yeah.
Like, let's talk about relationships. So you have someone who's had some bad relationships. Maybe there was some abuse. They still want to pursue relationships in general. But every time they get into one, there's the immediacy of the fear starts to rise up. Is that something, I don't know, I'm trying to think if that's something that we have to sort of teach the person, hey, it's not necessarily that your instinct needs to be squashed. Like you said, a little bit of anxious, a little bit of anxiety might be a good thing.
Yeah. I think sometimes separating, and this is a really hard one, but separating what is, you know, a baseline of like self-protection and what is overboard, where this is a trigger because of something that you've experienced. And I think that is where like the deeper work with therapy comes in, is there's a difference between there's this perceived fear of something that could happen versus I'm going into fight or flight mode right now because I've experienced a situation that I was actually very unsafe in. Or maybe it was
that makes sense. Yeah.
But that was the way that the body took it in.
Yeah, no, that I like that. I think that's exactly it. It's you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, there's something to be preserved about the instinct, right? There's something to be preserved about the instinct. You don't want the person to think that every time they have that response that it's necessarily going to be negative to them or cause a real negative trauma response. I think that's kind of what we're saying, right? Like it. So I like the way you said that. So, yeah. So I think the other thing I want to say about trauma too is that I think when someone is holding on, let's talk about that as a kind of a last piece to this. When someone is holding on to the experience, you run into somebody who doesn't necessarily know how to see themselves post-response to this trauma. Does that make sense? Like, maybe let's talk about that, because that's an interesting part of this, is that they're working on it, they're processing it, things are getting better, and yet we try to get them to a place where it's no longer hurting them, but something inside the client wants to hold on. Maybe can we talk about that a little bit? Have you experienced that?
Yeah, I have experienced that relatively often with clients. Sometimes trauma becomes part of somebody's identity, especially whenever the trauma was experienced at a young age. And I've seen it in the form of, because of this trauma, I became like, my personality formed into all of these different ways, even if they're positive ways. So sometimes people, they almost get scared of EMDR, of trauma therapy, because they think that if we process through these things, that then there's going to be this piece of them that is missing. Right. And it sounds so like counterintuitive against the goal that they're even coming into therapy for. But then whenever they come face to face with it, it becomes really scary for them because it's something that has been a part of them for so long, that the idea of having had worked through it and not being triggered and not being, experiencing all of the things that they experience whenever they think about it or are in a situation where they're associated. But also
to accept that they have to get to that point of acceptance, almost like if it was grief, right? They have to get to that point of acceptance like you do with grief. Like, okay, this is a new normal now, and it's okay for me to not have a heightened negative response.
Yeah.
That's okay, that you can actually be in that place and have it and not have it be something's wrong with me because I'm no longer feeling this horrible experience. I think that's an unusual piece. I think a lot of the times, like, they're no longer experiencing it the same way they were, and that scares them in and of itself. They get so used to oh gosh, this is going to be hard and I'm going to be down for a while. And that's an interesting part of this. So final thoughts on this topic. What would you like to leave the audience with when it comes to sort of approaching that you kind of touched on it, that question of, hey, whether or not do I actually have a trauma thing that I need to deal with because it's maybe did something more to me than I thought? What would be the mechanism then you would want them to know for, like, hey, you should go seek somebody out. Go ahead and seek somebody out and work through it. What would you say to somebody who's in that position?
Yeah,
I haven't done therapy yet.
I think that if you're in the position of you've experienced something traumatic, and kind of side note on that too, because I think there is a little bit of hesitancy whenever it comes to the word trauma, because people are like, is this actually traumatic? Or like, is it just the small thing? Like, and so I think that if there is an instance in your life or multiple instances where there has been like an extreme emotional weighing on you, even if it seems like a really small scenario, that it's definitely worth seeking help. And I also would look for someone who knows about trauma, who specializes in trauma. And I know on just Psychology Today or on Google, you can put in the keywords of like, you've gone through a breakup, literally looking up therapists who specialize in breakups.
Yeah, you get more choices than you want, right?
Yeah. So being really specific, I think is a good thing. But I mean, obviously I'm a therapist, but I've also been in therapy, and I've also done EMDR, and that's why I love EMDR. And so I think really challenging yourself to make that first step is a huge deal. And I know I'm biased, but I also...
Right. It's a good kind of bias. Yeah. I'm biased too, because I'm also a therapist and I have also been in therapy. I would say this about the whole thing. I like what you said there. Going to therapy might be the thing that allows you to separate that you had something happen, but it's not necessarily in a trauma status, that it was just a difficult situation and you actually did have resiliency. You actually did overcome it, and it's just a part of your experience now. So I do think that's an important distinction that you made. Well, thank you so much, Kailey, for this time that you spent with me. I hope to see you again. Special shout out to producer Shannon for saving us. We had a little bit of a technical difficulty halfway through. She bailed us out. So if anybody saw me make a strange face and tap the desk, that's why. I'm calling myself out so everybody knows. But thank you, Kailey, so much. It was a pleasure doing this with you, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Bye.